What's up guys? Welcome to another Ask Elvis. Normally of course on a Monday, this week it's on a Tuesday. I don't really know why, just thought we'd mix it up. But there we go, we're here now, we've got plenty of questions to get through. So let's get cracking. Right, let's start with this one from Peter M.G. Foster. Actually, this message came through last week, towards the tail end of last week, but I think it's particularly poignant and relevant right now, and I'm sure you guys will have plenty to say on this as well. Peter says, with McLaren unreliable and off the pace at Indianapolis, it looks like they might struggle to even qualify. Well, we now know, of course, that they did struggle to qualify, it didn't make it into the race. Will Alonso's patience run out with the team in orange, and did they underestimate the American open wheel scene? Keep up the good work. Thanks, Peter. So a couple of points in there. First of all, did they underestimate the open wheel scene in America? Probably they did, because actually McLaren, not so much Fernando, but largely McLaren went in all guns blazing and kind of talked a good game before they'd actually delivered anything on track. And ultimately, them failing to qualify shows how hard a prospect it is to get into that race, and that it's not an easy formula, it's not an easy category. And I do think, and this, I'm not saying this is exactly how McLaren treated this, but there is an arrogance around Formula One in general, that it's the best motorsport category in the world. Lots of us all believe it is, you know, I firmly believe it is as well, but that doesn't mean that just because you have had some success in Formula One over the years, you can go into any other category and dominate. Because the experience that the teams out in America have of open-wheeled circuit, oval racing, you know, it takes years to build up. And unfortunately, they have, you know, let themselves down on that in that regard. Will Alonso's patience run out? I kind of think it will. I mean, the thing with Alonso is that it depends what his priorities are now. Does he want to come back? Is the Indy 500 one of the biggest things on his priority list? Is it still something, because he wants this triple crown, so is that going to be at the top of his list? In which case, does he need to build up experience of open wheel racing in the States? And does he need to do that with a team perhaps like Andretti, who he raced for in the past, and come back to have a proper crack at the 500 next year with a more experienced team perhaps? Or does he still harbour some kind of dream to come back into Formula One in a competitive car? Because his only real route to do that in reality is through McLaren, because we've already seen that most other teams, certainly the bigger teams in Formula One, don't want to touch Fernando with a barge pole because of his history in the sport and his disruptive history in the sport. Can McLaren, over the course of the next 12 months, improve enough in Formula One to deliver a car that potentially could be race winning? Because if they could, that could perhaps be enough to tempt Fernando back through that McLaren contract into a Formula One car for next year. Maybe. Personally, I think that's a long shot. My honest feeling, my gut feeling, with no real evidence to back this up, my gut feeling would be that I think his patience will run out with McLaren, and he will probably end up cutting ties and trying to further his career in whichever direction it goes with somebody else. But I think it's been a harsh lesson for all involved, this Indy 500 dream that they had, building a team at McLaren around this. Bob Fernley, you know, brought in, of course, to run that whole programme, and I believe has left the team with immediate effect as of today, so I hear. So a real shame for everybody, because a lot of people put a lot of hard work and effort in. That's not to be underestimated. Massive respect to everybody. It wasn't through want of trying that they didn't qualify. I think it came down to lack of experience, and they were outperformed by those who do have experience and have done this many times before. Speed World says, how different is the fuel that F1 cars use to what we can buy at the pump? Would our own road cars run on it? Yeah, they would. It's not very different at all. The difference is in the detail. The formulations are based on pump fuel that you can buy, unleaded fuel. What happens is that the specific fuel companies tailor the minute details of the chemical composition to the power unit for each specific team, and that's tiny details, that's tiny little composition changes. The reality is, yes, your road car would absolutely run fine on it, and at the end of most Grand Prix we used to give away gallons of the stuff that was left over because it was easier for us to give it away rather than transport it from one country onto the next in air freight, particularly on the long flyaways. So we'd end up giving it away to a marshal or somebody who was hanging around the circuit towards the end of the day. Shogun Manuel George says, what do the Formula E teams do, if anything, to develop the powertrains in their cars? Are they even allowed to develop the technology? So yes and no. The powertrains, so that's everything behind the battery essentially, so the motor, the inverter, all the electronics, the gearbox, the rear suspension, the drivetrain from the battery rearwards is open for development by the teams, and each individual manufacturer creates their own and put a lot of work and design and everything into that to create their own bespoke powertrain. However, before the season starts, those designs have to be homologated, locked in with the FIA and with the governing body, with Formula E itself. And so beyond that point, the hardware is locked. You cannot then develop that, and that's there for the season. The biggest development, or the biggest area of development in Formula E during the season comes in terms of software and the way that you optimise that hardware that you've got on your car. So massive amount of R&D and time and energy goes into developing new software solutions that maximise the efficiency of your powertrain over the course of the season. So there's a yes and no answer to that one. Kevin Lee, he says, do teams have testing crews these days? I'm specifically asking about the Mercedes crew that are running Mazepin's 2017 car programme this year and Wednesday's test, as well as Stroll's 2014 car programme with Williams a few years ago. So that's a good question. So most teams don't have a separate test team anymore. They went out back in 2009, I think, when in-season testing was drastically cut as part of cost saving. However, lots of the bigger teams swallowed up many of that personnel into things like car build in the factory, demo run crew, so a much smaller crew that were able to run demo operations in certain cities. You may have seen Red Bull doing this a lot. McLaren do it, other teams do it as well, run demos. So what they have is when they need to do an outing, any outing with a car, they've got enough people to pull together to run the car. Now what happened with Stroll's situation, so before he started racing in Formula 1, as many of you will know, he ran a test programme in the preceding season with a 3-year-old car, which you're allowed to do within the rules. And that was a privately funded operation. So the Stroll family essentially funded all of the costs involved in that, including putting together a separate team to run that car. So essentially that was something that was built just specifically for Lance Stroll's testing programme that year. And the same kind of thing has happened with Mazepin in the Mercedes, and others have done it as well. I think, who else do we have? I think Latifi also did it in a Mercedes last year for various occasions. Ran a programme in a 3-year-old car, just getting used to Formula 1 operations, getting used to Formula 1 power and grip levels, running at many circuits around the world, using this standalone team that they would individually have funded through the charges that Mercedes would have charged onto them to be able to operate. So that's kind of how those kind of things work. Most teams don't have, in fact, I don't think any teams now have a standalone separate test team because there simply isn't enough testing. The test last week in Bahrain would have been operated largely by the race team. So a crew from the race team would have stayed on after the race to operate the car. And you know what happens is they rotate that crew. So the previous test in Bahrain, perhaps the other car crew would have done that test, and then the second car crew would have done this test, and that's how they operate over the year. Piers Butler says, "Hi Mark, love your videos, thank you. Firstly, what do you think of Martin Brundle's post-race article? He mentions the cars need to be lighter by 100 to 150 kilos. Why? He also mentions that he would prefer a bulletproof low-deg tyre even at the expense of strategy. Thoughts?" So I have now read Martin's article on the Sky Sports website. I'll link it in the description for those who haven't read it. It's really interesting. He makes a lot of very good points. And the two you've brought up there, the idea of making cars lighter. Cars are so much heavier in this era than they were a decade ago, and it's largely to do with the fact they're generally bigger anyway, but also the hybrid power unit, hugely heavy with the battery systems that weigh quite a lot. So the cars are hugely heavy, so that means there's a huge lump you've got to be dragging around the racetrack, so they're no longer as nimble as they used to be. The change of direction is not quite as fleeting as they perhaps were, quite a few years ago, where they were, not quite half the weight, but not far off. Hundreds of kilos lighter a few years ago. So that's why, I think Martin would like to see them being fleeting and nippy and nimble. And I think I can understand that. I can agree. I don't think that's a huge priority for me, but I can understand why he's saying it. In terms of the bulletproof tyres with low deg, yes, I totally get that, because one of the biggest problems we have with the tyres and the tyre formula that we have, they've of course made these high deg tyres to try and encourage more pit stops and try and introduce strategy, but the effect that it's had is we never see drivers pushing at the limit. A tiny amount of wheel spin and you've destroyed your tyres for the race. So drivers can't afford to do that. So we don't get the drivers running around on the ragged edge, which if you look back at really old footage from the 70s and 80s and 90s, that's what we had. Coming out a corner with a handful of opposite lock because you just overstretched it slightly. But that's what you had to do. You had to find those limits, just step over them, but get it back and continue and come back and have another go a couple of laps later. We can't do that now, because if you get a handful of opposite lock, your tyres are probably destroyed. So that's his thinking behind that, and again, I actually totally agree with him. I think one of the things I didn't necessarily agree as much with Martin, and you can let me know your thoughts on this, is that he firmly wants everything put back into the driver's hands. And I understand that, and I get that, and I agree to a large extent, but obviously coming from the engineering side, I still want to see the brilliance of engineering in Formula One. I still want to see this arms race, technical arms race between the teams as well, which is a very difficult thing to balance between driver performance and technical innovation. I still love seeing the innovation that we get, and you don't always see it in Formula One. Lots of it happens, buried away underneath the bodywork, and we never hear about it or see it. I'd like to see a bit more of that. I'd like to see it being tangible. And many of you will know I've talked in a couple of videos now about standardising aero. Hugely controversial idea, but my thought behind doing that was that if we standardise the aero, we can simplify a lot of the problems with following the cars in front with that dirty air problem. We can massively slash R&D costs, because the biggest chunk of anyone's R&D goes on aero tweaks, and we're talking about tiny little flick ups and flaps that no one can really notice or spot. And let's put most of that development cost and R&D time into another technical area of the car that we can see, that's going to be hugely innovative, that might actually lead change that could filter into road cars or filter into other areas of our lives that we can all benefit from. Let's make Formula One pushing the cutting edge of various technical innovations. That's what I'd like. But anyway, another story. Hopefully that's answered your question a little bit, Piers, but for those who haven't read the article, as I say, I'll link it in the description. James Zoo. Is it possible to have a feature race added to a Formula One weekend to make racing more exciting? If not, why? Love your videos. Thanks, James. Well, we've already got a feature race, haven't we? The actual race right now is a feature race. I presume what you mean is maybe a bit like Formula 2. Could we add in a sprint race, a second race over the weekend? And there is no reason we can't do that. And I know for a fact that Ross Brawn and his team are looking at those kind of solutions for 2021 when we get the big rule shake-up. There is no reason you couldn't introduce something like that, a sprint race on a Saturday, for example, that maybe determines the grid order for the Sunday feature race. There are so many solutions, there are so many ways you could shift and change up a race weekend. Many of them have their own pros and cons, and all could be debated endlessly. But there is no reason you couldn't do something like that. There are lots of merits to that. It works very well in Formula 2 and could work in Formula 1. But whether we want to do it or not, massively in-depth debate we should have on another day. Matthew Cook says, will Zandvoort being added to the calendar for 2020, with Zandvoort being added, it'd help if I could read, wouldn't it? With Zandvoort being added to the calendar for 2020, I'm concerned that it'll be yet another processional race that exists only to cater for Verstappen's Dutch fanboys. The track design is even less conducive to overtaking and racing than Spain. Thoughts? Well, many of you know my thoughts on Zandvoort because I went there not very long ago to have a good look around the circuit. I did some laps, I spoke to people there. It's an incredible circuit. It's a proper roller coaster of a lap. It's got twists and turns, it's got undulation, banked corners. I mean, it's an amazing lap. However, the circuit's only about this wide. So yes, you're absolutely right. It's going to be very difficult to overtake on the face of it around a circuit like that. But, as I would always say with stuff like this, let's not write it off before we'd had a race. There were lots of things we didn't like about Baku before we went there. Lots of people wrote that Grand Prix off as being a disaster before we'd even turned a wheel there. And yet actually we've had some of the best racing over the years that Baku's been on the calendar. It's become a favourite of mine and of many people. So although it looks like it's going to be very difficult to overtake, and it may well prove that that's exactly what happens, it could well be an absolute procession because everything's pointing towards that right now. But let's just wait and see. Let's give it a chance and see what happens. The atmosphere we know will be incredible, and yes, that may well come largely down to the Verstappen Dutch fanboys, as you call them. But if they create an amazing atmosphere, let's see that as a positive. A qualifying lap round there would be absolutely spectacular. It's an old school circuit where you'll be seriously punished if you get something wrong. So Saturday could end up a little bit like Monaco being perhaps the highlight of the weekend. And you know, you're absolutely right to argue. I can hear you all shouting at your your devices now going, but it shouldn't be the highlight of the weekend. The race should be the highlight of the weekend. Totally agree, and it may well prove that this is a circuit that doesn't really work for Formula One. But look, Formula One is changing massively over the next few years. The cars are changing, the rules are changing. Zandvoort has a contract that will go into the next era of Formula One, as far as I know, so maybe things will change. Maybe the Formula One, the formula, will swing more towards a track like Zandvoort. Let's wait and see and give it a chance before we write it off. Rafael Oliveira Uhu. I hope I pronounced that right, mate. Sorry if I haven't. He says, "Hi Mark, how could Ferrari not be able to beat their own time during pre-season testing?" And that was in Barcelona he's talking about, of course. Q3 was a 1:16.272. And testing was a 1:16.221. Well, there's lots of reasons, and one of them is that much of the testing, in fact almost all of the testing pre-season, was done on the softer end of the tyre range, because that's just what most people test on, because it's representative of more of the season than the harder end of the range, which are obviously faster tyres. The race in Barcelona, Pirelli brought the hardest 3 tyres in their range. So therefore, they also, of course, things like conditions had changed dramatically. Temperature was very different. The cars have changed and developed, but those other factors are huge. Tyre performance is a huge part of the overall performance of a Formula One car. So with those things changing so dramatically, it does have a huge impact on the actual eventual lap time or ultimate lap time that can be achieved. Duncan Brown says, "Hi Mark, question for your YouTube channel. Do you think F1 decision makers have damaged the sport by not introducing new rules 3 to 4 years ago? Previously, dominance in the sport has always been curtailed by rule changes like blown diffuser and active suspension, etc." Well, it's very easy to say that we should have been, intercepting this dominance 3 to 4 years ago. In reality, though, what you're saying about previous dominance in the sport has always been curtailed by rule changes, I'm not sure that's always true. Yes, there are certain examples, and things like the blown diffuser, great example of that, of course, and active suspension. But in reality, what curtails dominance in the sport is having a longevity of a rule set. So having stability in the rules. If you keep changing rules, it gives the teams the opportunity to do something different and create an advantage, and inherently the bigger, more well-funded teams are the ones who are able to do that easier and more quickly. So actually what happens is, and if you think back to the end of the old engine era, for example, the V8s, when we had that engine formula being stable for quite a few years, actually the performance between each of those really started to equalise. And I think actually the V6 hybrid era that we're in now, the rule makers would have every right to have assumed that by now most of those power unit manufacturers would have converged in performance much more than they have. And actually, I think they've got every right to be slightly surprised that Mercedes are still so dominant in that area. So I'm surprised myself. So actually, stability can often be the biggest solution to any kind of period of dominance. So let's see what happens. We are going to come up with a massive change in 2021, of course, and let's hope that that doesn't spoil what by then could be some kind of quite close racing, because everyone has converged over the next couple of years. Halcyon Gaming. Hi Mark, can a team swap drivers' cars to avoid a particular driver getting penalties? For example, if Lewis Hamilton was fighting for the title with Vettel and it was down to the last race and Hamilton had changed so many parts in the engine, he would get a grid penalty. No, they can't do that, because the penalties or the components for a power unit are applied to a driver, not to a car. So, you know, if Lewis Hamilton has changed two internal combustion engines, for example, it's Lewis Hamilton that's used two combustion engines, it's not his chassis. And if he swapped chassis, that two engines would not transfer with the chassis, they'd stick with Lewis Hamilton, if that makes sense. So no is the answer, you can't do that. Peter Wright. How do you think an F1 pit crew would get on if there were only 5 members, as in IndyCar, or even 4, as there's no refuelling? Would it spice up the racing? Would it spice up the racing? I don't think that would spice up the racing. No, I don't. I mean, what are you going to get? You're going to get Formula One process applied to whatever the new rules are. So if it's 4 people, 5 people, they would be the best 4 or 5 people. They would have that process nailed down to the finest degree possible. And yes, it would be slower than it is now, but it would still be just as slick. It would still have a minimum number of mistakes. I don't think it would spice up the racing at all. There's an argument to say that you could do it because you might want to save costs and everything else, and you might decide that there's too much risk involved in a modern Formula One pit stop. You could say it's just over in a blink of an eye, and if everyone's doing it in 2 seconds, there's no advantage to be had. I would disagree with all of that, and I absolutely love modern Formula One pit stops. I think it's one of the highlights of our sport. I think that everything in and around Formula One should be a wow. You should look at it and you should be, wow, how on earth are they capable of doing that? And that is what I think most people get when they look at a modern Formula One pit stop. It's the absolute pinnacle of preparation, technology, human performance. It's choreographed to a degree that most people can't even get their heads around. And having been part of that process and the adrenaline rush and the feeling you get when it goes well, and knowing that you as a mechanic can make a difference to winning or losing a race like that is incredible. And I think it's a really important part of the wow moments of our sport. So for me, I think we should keep it, but even if we didn't, I can't see it spicing up the racing, because I think it'd still be a wow moment, maybe just not quite so much. You'd still be awed at what these guys would be able to do, how quickly 4 people could do it. It just wouldn't be quite the wow moment that we get by saying, look at that, we can change wheels in less than 2 seconds now. And finally, Chris Wilson says, do you think the teams have attained too much influence and power within F1 with their own interests at heart? Liberty Media need to take back control of the sport for the future of Formula One. Well, what a poignant and brilliant question to end this on, because I know that you will all have views on this. I'm pretty sure I know that all of those views will probably echo mine when I say, absolutely Chris, the teams have too much power and it's all about them, and Liberty needs to take control back for the good of our sport. 100%. And that, on the face of it, you'd think was easy. I thought Liberty would come in with a bang and that would be their opportunity to sort of lay down the law and be, much harder than we've ever had before, and say, look, this is the future of Formula One. Here's the rule set, sign up or not, up to you, but this is what Formula One's going to be moving forward. What they have done is they came in like that almost, and they put down this this press release of what they thought Formula One should look like, and then they went to the teams and the manufacturers, and they all said, "Oh, I mean, yeah, I like what you're doing, but it doesn't really suit us. You know, we'd quite like to stick with this kind of route." So we've ended up with a very similar power unit, I think, for 2021 than what we've got now. I don't think we're going to have massively drastic rule changes, certainly not on the scale that we all kind of thought and hoped that they might be. And that is largely because the teams have all lobbied against Liberty Media and thrown their weight around, and Liberty seem to, and I'm saying this without any absolute rules written in stone yet, seem to have capitulated a little bit. So, Chris, 100% that's what I think should happen. It obviously is easier to say it than to do it. The teams and the manufacturers have a huge amount of control in this sport, and without them, of course, we'd be lost within the current way Formula One is run, and that's another problem, that Formula One's too reliant on these major manufacturers in our sport. So, you know, you've got to appreciate that if Mercedes packed up their tools and went, that's a huge number of cars powered by Mercedes power units that would suddenly be engineless. Same thing if Ferrari did it, and of course that's how Formula One is run right now. So it's more of a problem with the sport that we're not open and sustainable enough to allow in new manufacturers that could sustain this sport if those big manufacturers left. If Liberty want to be hard-nosed about it and say, right, sign up or just disappear, if they said, okay, well, we're going to go off, we're going to go and do Formula E, Formula One will be in a whole lot of trouble as things stand. So they need to address the core problem with our sport, I guess, to be able to put Liberty in a stronger position to lay down the law how they see it. Right, let me know what you think on all of those. Lots to discuss today, lots of really great questions, I think some really interesting topics as well, so I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know, pick out any of those topics, give me a shout in the comments, let me know what you think, and we'll pick up the discussion on there. But thanks very much as ever, and I will see you probably tomorrow.